The city streets bustled with their usual chaos, honking cars, hurried pedestrians, and the ever-present hum of conversations overlapping in a never-ending symphony of life. Among the crowd, a tall man in an expensive tailored suit walked with purposeful strides, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He was Zayden Varos, a self-made millionaire who had built his empire from the ground up. A man who had everything, or at least, that's what people believed. Success, power, luxury, he had climbed higher than most could dream. But there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though something was missing. Something intangible. Something that neither money nor success could buy. That afternoon, as he made his way from a high-profile meeting, he stopped near a street corner to check his phone. His driver was waiting a block away. Just as he was about to reply to an email, something caught his eye. 4 children sat huddled together on the sidewalk, their arms wrapped around each other for warmth. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their small bodies shivering in the chilly autumn air. Their faces were dirty, their hair unkempt. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was their faces. They were identical. 4 children, the same age, same features, same deep-set eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same expression of quiet resilience. A chill ran down his spine. He had seen them before. Or at least, he felt like he had. For a moment, he couldn't move. He simply stood there, staring, his mind racing. Something about them called to him, something deep, something distant. The world around him faded into the background. The blaring horns, the chatter of the crowd, the flashing advertisements, it all blurred. One of the children, the oldest-looking boy, lifted his gaze and locked eyes with him. Zayden's breath hitched. The boy didn't beg for money. He didn't plead for help. He just stared at him with an expression that sent a strange pang through his chest. "Sir?" A voice broke his trance. A woman carrying a grocery bag brushed past him, looking at him oddly. Zayden blinked and shook his head, forcing himself to look away. His heartbeat was unsteady. He had places to be. Calls to make. Deals to close. And yet, his feet refused to move. He stole another glance at the children. The oldest boy was still watching him, his expression unreadable. Zayden turned abruptly and walked away. He forced himself to focus on his phone, on his work, on anything but what he had just seen. But even as he slid into the back seat of his luxury car, even as the city buildings blurred past him, the image of those identical children refused to leave his mind. The next morning, Zayden sat in his high-rise office, sipping his usual black coffee, but he found himself staring out of the window instead of at his laptop screen. Something about those kids wasn't right. He had seen twins before. Even triplets. But 4 identical children? Alone on the streets? Where were their parents? Why did he feel like he'd seen them before? By mid-afternoon, his curiosity had become unbearable. With no explanation as to why, he found himself heading back to the same street corner. But when he got there, the spot was empty. The kids were gone. A strange pang of disappointment settled in his chest. He had no idea why it mattered, why he cared. It wasn't his problem. There were a million homeless kids in the city. Why did these 4 get under his skin? He turned to a nearby vendor, an older man, selling roasted chestnuts. "Excuse me," Zayden said. "There were 4 kids here yesterday. Sitting right there on the sidewalk. Do you know where they went?" The vendor glanced at him, then looked away, tending to his cart. "Kids come and go," he muttered. "Not my business." They were identical, Zayden pressed. 4 of them. They looked exactly the same. The vendor stilled for a fraction of a second before he resumed his work. "If you know what's good for you, you'll forget about them." Zayden's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The old man gave him a sharp look. "They're not normal kids." A strange chill crawled up Zayden's spine. "What does that mean?" The vendor scoffed. Rich folks like you shouldn't be poking around places you don't belong. He waved a dismissive hand. Go back to your fancy life, mister. Some things ain't meant to be found. Zayden clenched his jaw, irritation rising. He wasn't a man who took cryptic answers lightly. But before he could press further, the vendor turned away, refusing to speak another word. Something was very wrong here. Zayden wasn't the type to believe in superstition or urban legends, but he knew when people were hiding something. And the more people told him to forget about the children, the more determined he became to find them. For the next few days, Zayden searched. He checked different parts of the city. He asked around, vendors, shopkeepers, even local police officers. No one had a clear answer. Some had seen the children once, but not again. Others swore they had never seen them at all. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. One night, after another fruitless search, he sat in the back seat of his car, massaging his temples. His driver waited silently, accustomed to his long work hours and unpredictable moods. Just as Zayden was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He frowned and answered. Hello? A rough voice came through the speaker. Stop looking. Zayden's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? The line went dead. His pulse pounded. He stared at the screen, his gut twisting. Someone knew he was searching. And someone wanted him to stop. But Zayden Varos wasn't the type of man who backed down. He had to find those kids. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about them. This was about something he had forgotten. Something buried deep in his past. And for the first time in years, he felt an unsettling fear creeping into his heart. The air inside Zayden Varos's luxury car felt heavy. The unknown call still echoed in his mind. Stop looking. Who was trying to warn him off? And why? He set his phone down on the leather seat beside him, inhaling deeply. His instincts were screaming at him, this wasn't just some coincidence. Someone knew exactly what he was searching for. And if there was one thing Zayden hated, it was not having answers. He wasn't going to stop. He leaned forward, tapping the intercom for his driver. Take me back to the street corner. The driver hesitated for only a second before replying, yes, sir. The city lights blurred past the windows as they drove through the urban sprawl. The streets grew quieter as they neared the district where he had first seen the children. His stomach tightened. When they reached the spot, he stepped out, his eyes scanning the sidewalk. The place looked different at night. The streetlights cast eerie shadows, the storefronts were closed, and the few people who wandered around moved with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. His gaze swept over the empty pavement. No sign of the kids. Zayden exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then he spotted something. A small piece of cloth, wedged between a crack in the sidewalk. His heart pounded as he crouched down, pulling it free. It was old, tattered, and covered in dirt, but it had a distinct pattern. It looked like part of a child's sweater. One of the kids had been here recently. As he stood up, a voice behind him made him turn. You won't find them that way. Zayden's eyes narrowed as he faced the speaker, a woman in her late 50s, wrapped in a thick coat, standing near a dimly lit alley. She held a plastic bag filled with groceries, her lined face unreadable. You know where they are? Zayden asked. The woman studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You don't look like someone who belongs in this part of town. Zayden's jaw tightened. I don't care about that. I just need to know where they are. She hesitated, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then she took a step closer. If you're really looking for them, go to the abandoned church 3 blocks down. They show up there sometimes. But, she trailed off, shaking her head. But what? Zayden pressed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're better off leaving them alone. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Zayden clenched his fists. Why did everyone keep saying that? But at least now, he had a lead. Without hesitation, he headed in the direction the woman had indicated, walking briskly through the quiet streets. The abandoned church. The old church stood in eerie silence, its once grand structure now crumbling under years of neglect. The wooden doors were slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. Zayden hesitated. He wasn't scared, he had faced worse in his business world, but there was something unsettling about this place. He took a step forward, pushing open the door. The hinges creaked, echoing through the vast emptiness. The faint scent of damp wood and dust filled the air. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the main aisle. The pews were broken, covered in dust and debris. Then, he heard it. A soft shuffle. Someone was here. Zayden turned toward the sound, his heartbeat quickening. A small figure darted between the pews. His chest tightened. It was one of the kids. The boy he had locked eyes with before. The child's bare feet barely made a sound as he tried to slip away, but Zayden was faster. Wait. The boy froze mid-step. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The dim light from the broken stained glass windows cast fragmented colors over the child's face, making him look almost ghostly. Zayden swallowed hard. Who are you? The boy's jaw tightened. Why do you care? Zayden exhaled. Because I've been looking for you. The boy's eyes flickered with something unreadable, fear, suspicion, defiance. Then he did something Zayden didn't expect. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, guarded. You're wasting your time. Zayden frowned. Where are the others? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned and ran. Hey! Zayden called, chasing after him. The boy slipped through a side door, disappearing into the night. By the time Zayden got outside, he was gone. A warning he can't ignore. Zayden stood outside the church, his mind racing. He had finally found one of them, and lost him just as quickly. Something about the encounter didn't sit right with him. That boy wasn't just homeless. He was hiding something. A gust of wind sent a shiver down his spine. Then, his phone rang. Another unknown number. Zayden's pulse pounded as he answered. Who is this? A long silence. Then, a voice, low and cold. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Mr. Varos. Zayden gritted his teeth. Who are you? More silence. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time. The past should stay buried. Click. The line went dead. Zayden stood frozen, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His past? His stomach twisted. What the hell was going on? Digging deeper the next day, Zayden didn't go to work. He had one mission now, find out who those kids were. His gut told him this wasn't just some random street case. This was personal. He called in a favor from an old friend, someone who specialized in tracking down people, especially those who didn't want to be found. By evening, he had a file in his hands. And what he read inside made his blood run cold. His brother's name was in the report. His twin brother. A brother he hadn't seen in years. A brother he had tried to forget. But the worst part? The report said his brother was dead. And those children. They were his. Zayden's hands trembled as he closed the file. It didn't make sense. How had he not known? Why hadn't anyone told him? He thought back to the boy at the church, to the way he had smiled at him. Not with joy. But with recognition. A chill ran through him. That boy knew exactly who he was. And now, Zayden realized with gut-wrenching certainty. Those kids weren't just strangers. They were family. And he had abandoned them, just like he had abandoned his brother. For the first time in his life, Zayden Varos felt truly ashamed. He had failed them. And now, he had to make it right. Zayden sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the confidential report in front of him. The city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow across the room, but he barely noticed. The words on the page felt unreal. His twin brother, the brother he hadn't seen in over a decade, was dead. And those 4 children, they were his. His hands tightened into fists. How had this happened? How had he let this happen? A flood of memories rushed back. He and his brother had once been inseparable, growing up in a small, run-down neighborhood. They had been best friends, 2 halves of the same soul. But as they got older, things changed. Zayden had chased wealth. His brother had chased family. They had fought. Badly. Words had been exchanged, words Zayden now regretted. And then, one day, his brother had vanished from his life. Zayden had told himself it was for the best. That it was better this way. And now, his brother was gone. Truly gone. And those kids, the ones who looked so much like him, had been left alone on the streets. Zayden closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had spent his life building an empire. Yet the one person who had mattered most had been left behind. And now, his brother's children were suffering because of it. A deep anger boiled inside him, not just at the world, but at himself. He had failed them. He had failed his own blood. And he was going to fix it. Hunting for the truth the next morning, Zayden didn't go to work. His billion-dollar company, his countless meetings, his never-ending calls, it all suddenly felt irrelevant. Instead, he drove across town to one of the city's most run-down districts, the place where he had last seen the boy. He wasn't going to lose them again. He started asking questions. The old vendor, the shopkeepers, the street dwellers, someone had to know where they were. At first, people were hesitant. Some ignored him. Others told him to leave it alone. But Zayden wasn't the type to back down. After hours of searching, a young girl, barely a teenager, with tangled hair and a cautious gaze, approached him. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Zayden turned to her, his heart racing. "Yes." "Do you know where they are?" She hesitated. "You're not with them, are you?" "What do you mean?" She bit her lip, looking over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "The people who don't want them found." A cold chill ran down his spine. "Who are you talking about?" The girl shook her head. "I don't know. But they don't want those kids to be seen. They don't want them to talk to anyone." Zayden's stomach twisted. Someone was hiding them. Someone wanted them to disappear. And that only made him more determined. "Where are they?" he asked again. The girl hesitated, then pointed toward an old warehouse, near the edge of town. "They go there sometimes," she said. "To hide." Zayden didn't waste a second. He turned and headed straight for his car. The warehouse, the abandoned warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted metal doors covered in graffiti. Zayden parked a block away and stepped out, his pulse hammering in his ears. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rust, and every step he took felt heavy. He pushed open the door, wincing as it creaked loudly. The inside was dark, the faint glow of daylight filtering through cracks in the walls. He took a few cautious steps forward, then he heard it. A rustling noise. Zayden turned sharply. And there, crouched in the corner, were the 4 children. His chest tightened. They were huddled together, their small frames wrapped in oversized sweaters, their eyes wide with fear. Zayden exhaled, slowly raising his hands. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." The oldest boy, the one who had locked eyes with him days ago, stood up. His stance was protective, his shoulders tense. "We don't need your help," the boy said coldly. Zayden took a cautious step closer. "I'm not here to force anything. I need to know who you are." The boy's jaw clenched. Zayden could see it now, the resemblance was undeniable. These were his brother's kids. And this boy, he was his nephew. "My name is Zayden," he said carefully. "Zayden Varos. I knew your father." The boy's expression froze. For a moment, the silence stretched between them. Then, his fists tightened. "My father is dead," he said bitterly. Zayden swallowed hard. "I know." The boy's eyes darkened. "Then where were you?" Zayden felt that question like a knife to his chest. Where had he been? Living in luxury, building a fortune, forgetting the only family he had ever had. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice quieter. "I didn't know what happened to him." The boy let out a hollow laugh. "Of course you didn't. You left him. You left all of us." Zayden's stomach twisted. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain. But how could he? The truth was, the boy was right. He had abandoned his brother. And in doing so, he had abandoned them too. A second chance. Zayden took a deep breath. "I can't change the past," he said. "But I can change the future." The boy narrowed his eyes. "You think you can just walk in here, throw some money at us, and make everything better?" "No." Zayden shook his head. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to trust me. But I can promise you one thing, I won't walk away again." The boy studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned away. "Go home," he muttered. "You don't belong here." Zayden's heart ached. But he didn't leave. Instead, he sat down on the cold warehouse floor, crossing his legs. The other children watched him cautiously, as if waiting for him to get up and go. But he didn't. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still, he didn't leave. Eventually, the youngest girl, the smallest of the four, tugged at her older brother's sleeve and whispered something. The boy sighed. Finally, he spoke. "If you're staying," he said grudgingly, "you better not get in our way." Zayden almost smiled. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start. And he was willing to take it. Because for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. With his family. And he wasn't going to lose them again. The cold of the warehouse seeped through Zayden's expensive suit as he sat on the concrete floor. The musty scent of old wood and rusted metal filled his nose, but he ignored it. He was not leaving. The four children sat huddled together, their thin sweaters barely shielding them from the chill. The oldest boy, the one who had confronted him, kept a wary eye on Zayden, his arms folded across his chest. Hours had passed, but Zayden remained still. He wasn't here to force his presence on them. He was here because he owed them that much. Finally, the oldest boy spoke. "You think sitting here changes anything?" Zayden lifted his gaze. "No," he admitted. "But it proves I'm not walking away." The boy scoffed. "Rich people don't do anything unless there's something in it for them. What do you want from us?" Zayden's chest tightened. "Nothing. And everything at the same time. I want to know about my brother," he said softly. The boy's jaw clenched. His siblings glanced at him as if waiting for his reaction. Zayden took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. "I know I don't deserve your trust. But I need to know what happened to him. And I need to know what happened to you." Silence stretched between them. Then, after a long moment, the boy's fists relaxed. And he finally spoke. "A family torn apart, our father." The boy's voice was flat, but there was something buried beneath it, something raw. "He never talked about you. Not much, anyway." Zayden swallowed hard. He had always assumed his brother forgot about him. But now he wasn't so sure. "He had us in secret," the boy continued. "Didn't want anyone knowing. Said it was too dangerous." "Dangerous?" Zayden frowned. That didn't make sense. His brother had always been cautious, but never paranoid. "What do you mean?" he asked. The boy looked away, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his worn-out sweater. "He didn't trust people," he muttered. "Said some things were better left hidden." Zayden's mind raced. What had his brother been hiding? Before he could press further, one of the younger girls, the smallest of the four, spoke up. "Daddy said you were smart," she whispered. "But not smart enough to see the truth." Zayden's breath hitched. His brother had talked about him. But what had he meant? What truth had he been blind to? Something deep in Zayden's chest tightened. "I should have found him," he murmured. "I should have been there." The boy's eyes darkened. "Yeah," he said bitterly. "You should have." The words hit hard, but Zayden didn't flinch. He deserved that. He deserved worse. And he was done running from it. Piecing together the past as the night stretched on, Zayden listened. The children spoke in fragments, bits and pieces of their father's life, but the picture that formed was unlike anything he expected. His brother hadn't just disappeared from society. He had hidden himself deliberately. He had lived on the fringes, avoiding banks, avoiding government records, avoiding being found. Why? What had he been afraid of? And why had no one ever told Zayden about his brother's death? Zayden's mind raced as he connected the dots. Something wasn't right. Then, the oldest boy, who still refused to give Zayden his name, spoke the words that made his stomach turn. "Our father didn't die in an accident," he said. Zayden's entire body went rigid. "What?" The boy's expression darkened. "They said it was an accident," he muttered. "But it wasn't. Someone was after him." Zayden's heart pounded. His brother's death had never been questioned, at least, not in any report he had seen. But these kids, they knew something else. "Who?" Zayden demanded. "Who was after him?" The boy hesitated. Then, finally, he uttered a name. A name Zayden hadn't heard in over a decade. And his blood ran cold. The ghosts of the past. Zayden stood up abruptly, his pulse thundering in his ears. That name belonged to a man from his past. A man who had once been his mentor. A man who had been responsible for some of the most ruthless business deals in the city. A man who had disappeared without a trace, just like his brother. And now, it all made sense. His brother hadn't been running from life. He had been running from something bigger. And now those people knew about the kids. Which meant they were in danger. Zayden turned back to the boy, his jaw tight. "Pack your things," he ordered. "You're coming with me." The boy laughed bitterly. "Right. Because we should totally trust the guy who abandoned us?" Zayden's eyes burned with frustration. "This isn't about me," he snapped. "Whoever came after your father, they're not done." The boy's expression flickered with hesitation. Zayden's voice softened. "I know I don't deserve your trust. But I swear to you, on everything I have, I won't let them hurt you." Silence. Then, finally, the boy let out a slow breath. And he nodded. A promise he must keep. Zayden moved quickly. Within an hour, he had them packed into his car, their few belongings shoved into bags. As he drove through the darkened streets, his mind raced. This wasn't just about fixing his mistakes anymore. This was about protecting his family. Someone had gone after his brother. And if they knew about these kids, they wouldn't stop. Zayden clenched the steering wheel. For years, he had believed his wealth and power had made him untouchable. But now, he realized, he had been blind. His brother had been fighting a battle alone. And now, Zayden was about to step into a war he never saw coming. The oldest boy sat in the passenger seat, his arms still folded, his guard still up. But when Zayden glanced at him, something in his eyes shifted. A glimmer of reluctant trust. Zayden would not fail them. Because this time, he wasn't running away. He was running toward the truth. And he was ready for whatever it took. The sleek black luxury SUV moved through the city streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, Zayden Barros gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his thoughts racing. In the back seat, the four children sat huddled together, their expressions tense. The oldest boy, who still refused to give Zayden his name, sat in the front passenger seat, arms crossed, silent but watchful. Zayden stole a glance at him. The boy's face was an exact mirror of his brother's younger self. The same sharp cheekbones, the same piercing gaze, but harder, more guarded. And why wouldn't he be? Zayden had left. He had walked away years ago, never looking back. Now, he was trying to fix what was broken. But was it too late? A temporary refuge. Zayden pulled the SUV into the underground garage of his penthouse building, scanning the area carefully before turning off the ignition. He turned to face the kids. "This is where we'll stay for now," he said. The boy scoffed. "Yeah? And what happens next? You dump us in some foster home?" Zayden stiffened. "I said I wouldn't walk away," he replied evenly. "And I meant it." The boy didn't respond, but his gaze softened slightly. Zayden stepped out of the car, leading them into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, and the children stared in awe as the cabin ascended rapidly. When the elevator doors opened, their eyes widened. The penthouse was nothing like the world they knew. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The living room was massive, with sleek furniture, modern lighting, and a warmth that money could buy. "This place is huge," one of the younger kids whispered. Zayden watched them carefully, noting the way they hesitated before stepping inside. They didn't trust him. And why should they? Trust wasn't something you earned overnight. It was built. And Zayden had a long way to go. The weight of the past. As the night stretched on, Zayden sat at the dining table, his head resting against his palm. A laptop lay open before him, documents flashing across the screen, his brother's records, financial trails, anything he could find. But the more he searched, the more confused he became. His brother hadn't just vanished, he had erased himself. There were no bank accounts, no legal documents, no social security records for the past 8 years. It was like he had been living in the shadows. But why? What had he been running from? A soft noise made him look up. The oldest boy stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" the boy asked. Zayden hesitated, then gestured at the screen. "Trying to find the truth." The boy let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah? You're a little late for that." Zayden closed the laptop. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "But I need to know, what happened to him?" The boy's fingers tightened around the doorframe. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a quiet voice, he spoke. "A brother's final days. He always told us to be careful," the boy said. "To never let people know too much about us. He didn't use his real name. He moved us from place to place. And then, one day, he was just gone." Zayden's chest tightened. "He went out to get food," the boy continued. "And he never came back." Zayden's pulse pounded. No accident. No explanation. Just gone. "They told us it was an accident," the boy muttered. "That some car hit him. But I knew they were lying. My father was careful. He didn't make mistakes like that." Zayden's throat felt dry. "Who told you that?" The boy's eyes darkened. "The people who came looking for us." Unfinished business. Zayden felt a sharp pang of dread. His brother hadn't just been hiding from life. He had been hiding from someone. And now, those people knew about the kids. Zayden's stomach twisted. If they had come after his brother, would they come after his nephews and nieces next? The boy stared at him, challenging him, waiting for a response. Zayden took a slow breath. "You were right," he admitted. "I failed him. And I failed you." The boy's expression flickered. "But I swear to you," Zayden continued, his voice firm. "No one is going to hurt you." The boy didn't reply. But for the first time, he didn't look at Zayden with pure resentment. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe him. A threat that lurks in the shadows. The next morning, Zayden woke with a sense of unease. Something wasn't right. As he stepped into the kitchen, he noticed the oldest boy standing by the window, staring at the street below. Zayden followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. A black car was parked across the street. Zayden's jaw clenched. Whoever they were, they had found them. And now, it was a matter of time. The businessman's dilemma. Zayden knew what had to be done. For years, he had fought business battles, but this was different. This was personal. He wasn't going to let his brother's mistakes haunt these kids. And he wasn't going to let the past repeat itself. He turned to the boy. "Pack your things," he said. "We're leaving." The boy hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. For the first time, there was no argument. No resentment. Only trust. Because deep down, they both knew, this fight had only just begun. Zayden stood motionless, staring at the black car parked across the street. Whoever was inside wasn't moving. But the message was clear, they knew. They knew the kids were here. They had been watching. Waiting. Zayden clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had spent years making powerful enemies in the business world. He knew when he was being threatened. But this wasn't about him. This was about his brother's children. And he'd be damned if he let anything happen to them. He turned to the boy, his nephew, who was still watching from the window. "Pack your things," Zayden said, his voice firm. "We're leaving." The boy hesitated. "Where?" "Somewhere safer." The boy scoffed. "Safe? There's no such thing." Zayden met his gaze. "There will be." For the first time, the boy didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked toward the others. Zayden exhaled, rubbing his temples. Time was running out. Whoever was after them wouldn't wait forever. And Zayden wasn't about to sit around and find out what they wanted. He grabbed his phone and made a call. An old ally. 30 minutes later, a knock echoed through the penthouse. Zayden opened the door to find a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a dark suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Nathan Cade. A former private investigator, now one of the few people Zayden actually trusted. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again," Nathan said, stepping inside. "I take it this isn't a social call." Zayden shut the door behind him. "I need answers." Nathan arched a brow. "About what? Who's after them?" Zayden gestured toward the kids, who were cautiously watching from the other room. Nathan studied them, his gaze lingering on the oldest boy. Then he turned back to Zayden. "That's your brother's kid, isn't it?" Zayden nodded. Nathan let out a low whistle. "Damn. You two really were identical." Zayden's jaw tightened. "I need to know who's behind this. Who was after my brother? And why they're still watching." Nathan folded his arms. "You realize you might not like what I find, right?" "I don't care." Nathan studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'll start digging." The escape plan. While Nathan worked, Zayden focused on getting the kids somewhere safe. His penthouse wasn't secure anymore. He had safe houses, properties under different names, hidden from the public eye. He had always used them for business, now they were for family. That thought still felt strange to him. Family. For years, Zayden had convinced himself that he didn't need one. And now? Now, he was willing to risk everything to protect them. That night, he led them to an underground parking garage, guiding them toward a black SUV with tinted windows. As they climbed inside, the oldest boy hesitated. "You really think this will stop them?" Zayden met his gaze. "No. But it'll buy us time." The boy didn't respond. Then, quietly, he climbed into the car. Zayden took the driver's seat, scanning the garage for any signs of movement. The black car was gone. But that didn't mean they weren't being watched. With a deep breath, he started the engine. And they disappeared into the night. A hard truth: the safe house was a secluded property on the outskirts of the city, quiet, hidden, and secure. As they stepped inside, the children looked around, their eyes filled with cautious curiosity. It wasn't as extravagant as the penthouse, but it was warm, clean, and safe. For the first time, the youngest girl smiled. Zayden felt something tighten in his chest. How long had it been since they felt safe? Since they had a place to just be kids? He turned to the oldest boy. "You should get some rest." The boy hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "My name is Rylan." Zayden's breath hitched. For days, the boy had refused to tell him. Refused to let him in. And now, finally, he had. Zayden nodded slowly. "Thank you, Rylan." The boy didn't respond. But for the first time, he didn't look at Zayden with resentment. And that was enough. For now. Nathan's discovery: the next morning, Zayden's phone buzzed. "Nathan." He answered immediately. "What did you find?" Nathan's voice was grim. "It's worse than we thought." Zayden's stomach twisted. "Tell me." Nathan exhaled. "Your brother, he wasn't just hiding. He was running. And I know why." Zayden's grip on the phone tightened. "Years ago, he got involved with the wrong people," Nathan continued. "Powerful people. The kind that don't forgive debts." Zayden's jaw clenched. "You're telling me he owed someone?" "No," Nathan said. "I'm telling you he took something. And they want it back." Zayden's pulse pounded. "What did he take?" Nathan hesitated. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. "Proof." Zayden frowned. "Proof of what?" Nathan's voice lowered. "Corruption. Laundering. Dirty money." He was sitting on evidence that could take down some of the most powerful people in the city. Zayden's blood ran cold. This wasn't about revenge. This was about silence. They had killed his brother to erase him. And now, they wanted the kids gone too. The fight ahead. Zayden set the phone down, his hands clenched into fists. His brother had been hunted down for trying to expose the truth. And now, his enemies weren't finished. Zayden turned to Rylan, who stood in the doorway, watching. "They killed my father, didn't they?" Rylan asked softly. Zayden exhaled. "Yes." The boy's fists tightened. Zayden stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "They think they've won," he said. "But they haven't. Not yet." Rylan's eyes narrowed. "What are you gonna do?" Zayden's jaw tightened. "I'm going to finish what your father started." Rylan studied him, searching for doubt. But he didn't find any. And for the first time, he nodded. A new purpose. That night, as the children slept, Zayden sat alone, staring at his brother's old files. For years, he had been running from the past. Now, he was facing it head-on. Because this wasn't just about protecting his brother's kids. This was about justice. And Zayden Varos didn't lose. His brother had died trying to do the right thing. Zayden wouldn't let that be in vain. Because this time, he was going to win. And he was going to bring them down. No matter what it took. The world outside the safe house was quiet. Too quiet. Zayden Varos stood by the window, staring at the empty road beyond the tree line. He had spent his life trusting no one, yet here he was, protecting 4 children who barely trusted him. His brother had died trying to do the right thing. And now, it was Zayden's turn. Behind him, Rylan stepped into the dimly lit room. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" The boy's voice was laced with skepticism, but there was something else there too, a hint of belief. Zayden turned to face him. I don't start things I don't intend to finish. Rielan folded his arms. You don't even know if you can win. A smirk tugged at the corner of Zayden's lips. I don't play to lose. The boy studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Maybe he was finally starting to believe in something other than survival. The last call. Zayden's phone rang. Nathan. He answered immediately. Tell me you have something. Nathan's voice was sharp. I found it. Zayden stiffened. The evidence? All of it. Your brother hid a data drive. Bank transactions, offshore accounts, names, everything. Zayden's stomach clenched. This was what they had killed his brother for. Nathan continued. I traced where your brother stored the files. But there's a problem. Of course there is, Zayden muttered. What is it? They're not just watching you anymore, Nathan said. They know what you're looking for. Zayden's grip on the phone tightened. Then it's time to stop running. Nathan let out a low chuckle. I figured you'd say that. Zayden ended the call. He turned to Rielan, who was still watching him carefully. Time to end this, Zayden said. The boy's eyes darkened with understanding. Let's do it. The truth they tried to bury. Zayden drove them deep into the city, to an old abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of town. Nathan was already there, waiting by the rusted entrance. The kids stayed in the car. Rielan didn't argue this time, he knew what was at stake. Nathan led Zayden inside, past rows of storage units, coated in dust. This is it, Nathan said, stopping in front of a heavy metal door. Your brother left it all here. But once we take this, they'll know we have it. Zayden exhaled. They already know. Nathan nodded and punched in a 6-digit code into the rusted keypad. With a click, the lock disengaged. The metal door groaned as it swung open. Inside was a single briefcase. Nathan picked it up, flicked open the latches, and revealed a hard drive and a stack of documents. Zayden reached for it, his fingers brushing against the drive. And that's when he heard it, the faint scuff of a boot on concrete. His stomach dropped. They weren't alone. The confrontation, a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. Zayden turned sharply, his muscles coiled. A man stepped out of the shadows, dressed in an expensive suit, his expression calm, amused. Mr. Varos, the man said smoothly. I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this. Zayden recognized him instantly. The same man who had once worked with him in the corporate world. The same man who had disappeared around the same time as his brother. Elias Cross. Zayden's jaw tightened. You're the one who had my brother killed. Elias tilted his head. Such strong accusations. But let's be honest, you didn't care about your brother until now. Zayden's fists clenched. Elias smiled. Walk away, Zayden. Take your wealth, take your empire, and forget about all of this. Otherwise, his voice dropped. The children will suffer the same fate as their father. Zayden's blood boiled. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't someone who turned his back. Not again. I have the evidence, Zayden said coldly. And I'm going to expose everything. Elias sighed. That's disappointing. With a snap of his fingers, 2 armed men stepped forward from the shadows. Nathan stiffened beside Zayden. Zayden's mind raced. The odds weren't in their favor, but he had learned something from his brother's mistakes. His brother had tried to fight alone. Zayden wasn't alone anymore. The game-changer before Elias could give the order, a sudden noise echoed from outside. Sirens. Tires screeching. A dozen police cars swarmed the warehouse entrance. Elias froze. Nathan smirked. I made a call before we came in. Zayden let out a breath. Nathan had bought them time. Armed officers stormed in, weapons raised. Elias cursed under his breath as he realized his mistake. Zayden turned to him, voice calm but sharp. This is over. Elias shot him a dark glare. You think this changes anything? Zayden stepped closer. For my brother? His voice was ice. It changes everything. Elias was taken into custody, along with his men. And for the first time in years, Zayden felt free. A new beginning. Back at the safe house, the children sat in the living room, waiting. When Zayden walked in, Raylan was the first to stand. Zayden nodded. It's done. Raylan searched his face. They're gone? Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time, Raylan exhaled deeply. Like a weight had been lifted. Zayden watched him carefully. You're free now. Raylan's eyes darkened. And what happens now? Zayden took a step closer. You don't have to trust me, he said quietly. But I meant what I said. I'm not walking away. Raylan studied him. Then, slowly, he nodded. Maybe, just maybe. Zayden had finally earned his place in their lives. A lesson learned. Weeks passed. The kids adjusted to their new life. Zayden made sure they had everything they needed, a safe home, education, support. But more than that, he made sure they had him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Raylan stood beside Zayden on the balcony. I used to hate you, Raylan admitted. Zayden didn't flinch. I deserved that. Raylan exhaled. But you came back. Zayden turned to him. I won't make the same mistake twice. The boy studied him for a moment. Then, finally, he smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't bitter. It was real. And in that moment, Zayden knew he had finally done something right. Because at the end of the day, wealth meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. And for the first time in his life, Zayden Barros wasn't alone. He had a family. And he wasn't letting them go. The end.